This meeting of the Joint Appropriations Subcommittee for Education will now come to order. The Secretary will take the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Vice Chair Fuller.
Here.
Representative Keogh.
Here.
Representative Matthews.
Here.
Senator Windy Boy.
Excused.
Senator Regier. Here. Representative Jones.
Excused.
Representative Barker.
Here.
And Chair Beatty.
Here. We have a quorum. We'll continue. So today we're conducting our third and final day of budget hearings for the State Library. The primary thing that we'll attack is their final program, their GIS programs. We've already seen presentations of other activities in the library, and that will conclude our so-called deep dive into this particular agency. Before we do that, though, I see that the State Library responded to an inquiry made at our last meeting concerning the status of the coal severance tax fund. And State Librarian, if you could just quickly walk us through that, or have one of your staff members do that.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thanks for having us again. I would like Melissa Briggs, our Central Services Manager, to walk through it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This handout is just sort of a summary and overview of the coal severance tax fund that is provided at 0.93% of coal severance tax revenues to the State Library. One thing we just wanted to point out, that the revenues do vary quite a bit over a several year period. We did see a decline in the last year, and the next several years we'll also see between a 6% and 8% decline. That's based on the HJ2 numbers that you all have been looking at. We have just come off of several years of higher than usual revenues, which we have utilized for the hotspot program. So by the end of this fiscal year, FY25, we will have depleted the excess in reserve that we typically see. We've also listed out the statutes so you can be familiar with those and what we can spend the funding on. And I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Any questions from members of the committee? Well, I have one. And so your FY 2025 figures are show revenue through the first part of December, correct?
Yes, this is actually a screenshot of the LFD chart that's in the budget analysis. And yeah, that is through early December, I believe. We have spent some more funding out of this particular pot, but we're still on track with our budget. So there's nothing out of the ordinary to report.
And what is the projection for revenue through the end of the fiscal year?
When we looked at per the LFD's numbers, there was, I believe, a 6% decrease from FY24 for FY25. I can pull it up if you want the exact number.
I think for now that's fine. So your projection for FY 2025 is for total revenue coming in is 6% less than the $664,000 that is reflected in this chart?
That's correct. And also keep in mind that we had an ending fund balance that we also need to take into account. So if the ending fund balance from 24 was $480,000, and we hope for approximately $600,000, and our appropriation is $900,000, we should be, depending on how all the numbers shake out, it should be a break even for the year, and with an ending fund balance close to maybe between 0 and 50,000.
I think I'm having a hard time following that math on that.
Okay. Okay. Let me get the exact numbers for you, and I'll have it in just a few minutes.
All right, we can take that up at the end of the meeting, and certainly we can work this out before our work session. That'll be a few weeks from now. Are there any other questions from members of the committee? Very well. Let's continue on then with our deep dive into the State Library. State Librarian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. Again, Jenny Stapp, your state librarian. I just wanted to mention that you provided us with a number of other questions on Friday when we were discussing some of our other programs. So we have provided answers to those questions in the form of an email to Julia, and so those will be shared with you. But we did respond to questions about our outreach services for our Talking Book program, questions about the Lego Challenge, and we provided links to more information about our History Portal Lego Challenge and those virtual trunks. There's information about the 14 libraries that are not in the shared catalog. Those are broken down by Senate and House districts. And we also have a link on our website to information about libraries broken down by Senate and House district that includes information about which of the different statewide programs you heard about on Friday they take advantage of or not. We provided information about the career program. Mr. Chair, you had asked for the percentage of the population not served by the career program as opposed to the percentage of libraries. That percentage is 33% that are not served in some way by the career. And then I butchered a stat in my testimony on Friday that I wanted to clarify for the record. Of those libraries that are not currently served by a courier system of some kind, in FY24, they lent 21,357 items between each other, relying on the USPS rather than a postal service at a cost of approximately $132,000. The point that I wanted to make was the cost savings. Had they had access to a courier program, they would have spent approximately $5,500 or a savings of about $126,000, Mr. Chair. And then to Vice Chair Fuller's question, he had asked about the lifespan of a hotspot device. It's approximately 3 years per device. And then finally, there was a question from Representative Keogh about the library that did not receive state funding because they did not meet the public library standards. That library missed out on $7,330. And again, if anybody has any follow-up questions about the information we've provided, we'd be happy to answer that.
Do any members of the committee have questions on the information that was emailed to us? Well, if you don't now, I'm sure that the state librarian would be happy to answer your questions, and we can take them up again during our scheduled work session. Very well. Thank you for the quick responses on our request for information. And now let us move on to your GIS related programs.
Okay. Moving on, our final functional area is GIS data and information programs. We have 13 positions budgeted as well as 13 modified positions to conduct work across a variety of different data collections. I sometimes refer to this functional area as the traditional library, in that this is the group of staff who maintain collections of information. They respond to information requests, they answer reference requests, and they provide access to the information that we maintain. I also wanted to make the point that as we were thinking about the functional areas, in some ways it is challenging to sort of neatly divide the work of our staff because, as you heard on Friday, our patron services position also maintains a collection of academic and professional resources for state employees and responds to state employee reference requests and requests from the public. So some of that more traditional library service work is contained within the functional area of our patron services too. But as we think about some of those little bit more unique services that we're going to talk about today, they're contained within this functional area. Moving on to the next slide. We have a significant variety of funding sources that provide funding to this functional area, and we'll go through those in a little bit more detail as we go through each of the programs in this functional area. But as you can see, there's some general fund, there's quite a bit of state special revenue funds, our Montana Geospatial Information Act funds, there's the statutory appropriation of our 911 funds. We have some contract work that we do, for example, a contract with the Secretary of State's office. This is where we have the proprietary fund for the Montana State Reference Network and so forth. And again, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we look at the specific programs and how they spend their funding. Next slide. We're going to start with a functional area we refer to as information access. So these are the staff that are primarily involved in collecting and making information available in our government information, our natural resource information, and our GIS programs. And again, you have a little bit more breakdown on the staffing. We have 8 positions budgeted and 7 modified positions. And again, as I pointed out earlier, a variety of different funding sources. Next slide. We wanted to start with our government information program. This is one of the oldest information programs within the state library. It was established by statute in 1967. You might be familiar with the concept of depository programs. There are federal and state depository programs across the country that ensure that people have access to information produced by their government. And that's the intention of this work. Established in 1967, the Montana State Library was designated as the state depository for state government information. And I want to distinguish state government information from government records. In Montana, state government information is defined as information that's intended for public distribution, as opposed to records such as minutes and hearings from legislative sessions or other kinds of committees. These are things like the published reports, annual statistics, audit reports, and other kinds of government information that's created intended for public distribution. Historically, we would have received copies of print publications from agencies and retained some for ourselves and then distributed them to libraries around the state to make access to those publications through their libraries. And in approximately 2007, we went through an effort to modernize the legislation associated with the state government depository program in recognition that agencies were not producing publications in print, recognizing that state agencies' websites were largely what constituted publications for agencies preparing and distributing information to the public. And its agency websites are what housed those publications, our PDF annual reports, for example. So by modernizing the legislation, we were able to recognize and change our workflows in order to better capture more information about state government information and ensure that we had an ability to provide permanent public access to that information. So we began digitizing the print collection of state publications that we had available, and we worked in partnership with the Historical Society to digitize state publications dating back to 1864, including the first records of the territorial legislature in 1864. We currently have a little over 32,000 digitized state publications that are freely available online through a partnership with the Internet Archive. And we continue to add slowly to that collection over time. We have completed the digitization of our legacy collection, as well as any unique publications that the Historical Society housed. Now adding to that collection occurs when we hear from an agency who's discovered a collection of publications that they may have in their records. We've also been doing a lot to work with the law library and the legislature to make sure all of the laws and legislative hearings have been digitized through that process. And then also beginning in 2007, we under contract began archiving state agency websites. So we have a contract with the Internet Archive that crawls agency websites on a certain frequency. We have the ability to look by website to see which websites change more frequently, and we're able to archive those on varying schedules based on the frequency of change. The Internet Archives themselves have been crawling websites back to 1996, so we have an archive of agency websites back to 1986. Those are largely keyword searchable, and so this process has significantly enhanced the public's ability to access information about Montana government. Before we look at just some of the key performance measures, I wanted to make a point about an opportunity for efficiency that we're working on. As you may recall, there was an Office of Public Information Requests created last legislative session under the Department of Administration. And as we're figuring out how to work with that office, we see a number of what we would consider just public reference requests. For the example, the number of types of employees in certain agencies going to that office rather than coming to the state library. That office was really created to make sure that true public records, those kinds of things like emails, again, minutes, that kind of thing that might not already be publicly accessible are addressed. So we want to make sure that that office is not spending time needlessly answering the kinds of reference requests that should otherwise come to the state library. So that's an opportunity that I hope we can improve over the next year. Julia, if you could just go to the outcomes and key performance measures. And as you can see, as I said, we have over 32,000 state publications. That little word cloud gives you an idea of some of the most frequent content that's found in those publications. I also wanted to draw your attention to the archived websites tab. It gives you an idea of, by agency URL, which agencies are seeing the greatest frequency of review by people who are accessing this web archive. Prior to moving to this digital-based state depository program, we would average maybe 2,000 requests for publications a year. That was in 2006. As you can see, looking at these page view statistics, we're far surpassing the amount of access and usage that we were seeing when this was largely a print-based program. And of course, agencies then don't have to bear the cost of producing actual print publications and distributing them to us in some kind of physical format. We also don't then have to bear the cost of shipping those publications. So this has been a significant transformation of our government information program over the years, and we believe it's provided vastly improved transparency to state government information. Are there any questions about our government information program before we move on?
Proceed.
Next slide. Continuing on, in the 1980s, the state created a natural resource information system. This program was created at a time following the passage of the Montana Environmental Policy Act, which, as you know, mandates the creation of MEPA documents looking at various natural resource impacts that might be impacted through development in our state. And there was a recognition in the early 1980s that agencies and organizations that were complying with MEPA were reviewing and collecting information about the same locations around the state, and that information would better be collected once and made commonly available. And so in 1983, when the NRIS program was established, it was actually a program of the Department of Administration. And very quickly in 1985, that program was moved to the State Library in recognition that, again, this is public information. It should be made commonly available, and the natural home for that then would be a library. And the State Library at the time understood and recognized the value in doing so, and so they were happy to take on that program. Because natural resource information is really location-based, it's based on a point on the ground, we were one of the early adopters of geospatial information services, GIS software, to help us better manage natural resource information for Montana, which is one of the reasons why we're one of the premier GIS programs. And really, NRIS is viewed as one of the premier natural resource information programs around the country. Next slide. So moving into our Natural Heritage Program, which is one of the programs of the Natural Resource Information System. It's the program that maintains and provides access to information on Montana species, habitats, and invasive species, and they do that through maintaining collections of information, as well as through online applications like the Montana Field Guide and a map viewer application. And again, by having access to common information, anybody, regardless of their information needs, is getting access to the exact same information without any kind of regulatory bent to the information that they're receiving. And that saves anyone, state agencies, developers, the general public, time and money to access that information. One of the things that we often hear is how access to this kind of information speeds regulatory work. Instead of having to go out into the field and actually conduct a survey for a species before development work or MEPA filings can occur, that information is already available online. And as I mentioned a couple of days ago, that process of asking for that information used to involve a request to our staff, who then had to compile reports and send it back to the requester. Through some of our online tools, like our environmental summary report, anyone, you can literally identify an area of interest and with the click of a button generate a report that has the species and habitat information organized for you. You can just turn that around and submit that with any regulatory filings that you might be involved in. And as you can see by the statistics there, the number of downloaded items from our map viewer continues to significantly increase over time as more and more people become aware of the information. One of the areas where we're being called upon to provide more and more information is in identifying invertebrate species. We lack information for about 8,000 invertebrate species in the state of Montana, and as habitats change, those invertebrate species are being impacted by things like prevalence of fire on the landscape. We also know that work is being done to identify and understand the importance of pollinators, for example, in our state. And right now we lack a lot of information about those particular kinds of species. A few points that I wanted to make about some of our current cost drivers for this program and key activities. With the passage of Senate Bill 382 last session, the Land Use Planning Act, our staff are working with local governments to make sure that they have access to the information to ease the process of completing those land use plans at the local level. We're currently working with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on their State Wildlife Action Plan. FWP is, of course, responsible for information about game species in Montana, and our Natural Heritage Program works with them to help them collect and manage information about Montana's non-game species. Another area of focus that's been an area of focus for a number of years is understanding the prevalence of bats and bat species around the state, both in efforts to support wind development, wind energy sightings, and their impact on bat species, as well as in monitoring for the incoming white nose syndrome that we know has been impacting bat species around the state. I think one of the key points for this committee to be aware of is that when we hear about species of concern and potential listings of endangered species, it's often due to simply a lack of information about that species. And it's very costly, as you know, for a state government or the federal government to have to create management plans for species of concerns or species that have been listed as endangered. And again, by having access to information, sometimes those very costly listings can be avoided, as was the case with a plant species called water howellia a couple of years ago. It was a plant that was being considered for listing, but through the collection of information, we were able to determine that that plant species was much more widely available in the Sleely Swan area than previously recognized, and so they were able to avoid listing of that particular kinds of species. So that's a significant impact and ultimately cost benefit to the state of Montana. One other key partner that I wanted to bring to your attention is the timber industry. We make some customized tools available for different industries, the timber industry being one of them. There's a program called the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, where timber companies can certify that they are harvesting in ways that meet the Sustainable Forestry Initiative qualifications by understanding and making sure that they're not harvesting in areas where there may be sensitive species. Ultimately, timber companies who meet the Sustainable Forestry Initiative certification can sell their timber at higher market prices. And so this is something that we've worked closely with the timber industries to support now for a number of years. Mr. Chair, I think that concludes the information. I wanted to ask Mr. Hammer if he had anything else about the Heritage Program he wanted to make sure to hit upon. Okay.
I don't see any questions around the table, so please continue.
Let's move on then to the next slide. The water information system makes up the other component of our natural resource information system. It was created in the late 80s or early 1990s, and for a number of years we didn't have any staff associated with this position. In 2013, we requested one-time funds from the legislature in order to understand the benefit of having a dedicated staff person to support this position, and ultimately we received permanent funding for the position in 2015. The water information system collects and provides access to information, to Montana water resources information, including drought status and hydrography data. If you're not familiar with hydrography data, it's really the movement of water and stream flow on the land. And so more and more we are involved in helping to manage elevation information about the state of Montana, because of course elevation determines how water is going to flow across the land. It's for that reason that we have become more involved in helping the state to collect LIDAR information. Our role has been to organize partners to contribute funding towards the collection of LIDAR information in a partnership with the USGS, and I'm happy to report that by the end of this calendar year, we will have a complete statewide LIDAR inventory for the state. We estimate the cost for that program for the collection to be between $30 and $40 million. It's been largely federal funders that have come to the table to help support that effort, so there have been almost no state dollars put to the collection of that LIDAR inventory. Another program that we're responsible for managing is access to drought impacts and the drought monitoring maps. We work closely with the Governor's Drought and Water Advisory Board to make sure that they have information about drought status and water impact. And so you can look at some of our mapped resources and have access to, are they monthly maps that show the drought or when we have more water impact across the state. It's a remarkable collection of that kind of information. In 2017, when there was a significant flash drought in northeastern Montana, we began a drought reporting tool where Montana citizens can go online and collect information about the impacts that they are seeing on the ground from drought or flooding, as the case may be. And so we have a really remarkable archive of that kind of direct impact that Montana citizens are seeing from either drought or too much water on the land. A point that I wanted to make about our LIDAR collection, of course, when LIDAR is collected for an area, it's really just a snapshot in time of what that landscape looked like, what the elevation looked like at that time. And changes do occur on the landscape, like the floods that we saw in south central Montana in 2022 that dramatically shaped some of the elevation and landscape in that region. That's an example of when new refreshed LIDAR might need to be collected in order to do some of the analysis work that's done using LIDAR, such as floodplain analysis. This particular collection of information is used extensively by DNRC's floodplain mapping program to create current floodplain maps. I also wanted to make the point that when a citizen's property is designated to be in a floodplain or not, if they have questions or concerns about that designation, that citizen can also request this same LIDAR information for their property and use it to challenge a floodplain designation if they had that cause to do so. Julia, if you wouldn't mind, under the outcomes and key performance metrics, just click on the LIDAR acquisition status map. So anyone can go online and see where, go ahead and click on that next tab, thanks. Where in the state there's LIDAR available and when it's coming or when it's expected. And then they can go in here and identify LIDAR for a particular area that they may be interested in. If they have requirements for larger amounts of data, that's something that our staff can also provide directly to them for use in processing. An example of how we are working with local governments to use this data now that we have a nearly statewide collection is working in Sanders County. Under a contract, we worked with them to use LIDAR to generate the footprints of buildings larger than 100 square feet and higher than 10 feet. This is an example of information that they can then use for property tax assessment, permitting compliance, and public safety, making sure that they have an accurate record of the structures that exist and significant information, including the square footage and elevation of those buildings in their county. That's just one example of the numerous ways in which this kind of imagery can be used to help speed that kind of planning effort. Evan, anything else you would add? Okay. Are we ready to move on? Okay. All right. I've referred to several different themes so far of data, hydrography data, the species and habitat information that informs our land cover data. Those are examples of themes of data that exist in what we call the Montana Spatial Data Infrastructure. These are 15 statewide mapping themes that help people view and understand information about Montana through a mapped form. And the Montana State Library is responsible for maintaining information about a number of them, as well as coordinating information and access to that information in partnerships with other state agencies, other federal agencies, and the Montana University system. The data is informed by standards that coincide with the National Spatial Data Infrastructure, which is very similar to Montana's. We do have a few extra themes that we think are of importance to the state of Montana. The Montana Geospatial Information Advisory Council, which we oversee, has oversight over what becomes a theme within the Montana Spatial Data Infrastructure. And as we'll talk about more as we talk about state GIS coordination, it's really important for us to work with partners, including local governments, because when we're creating these kinds of authoritative data sets, we want to make sure we're not duplicating effort. We want to make sure that the data that we collect meets a variety of different partner needs, and that we know that data is most accurate when it's collected closest to the ground. And so we need to be working especially with our local partners to make sure that we're collecting and contributing information to our spatial data infrastructure that meets those needs. Let's go ahead and move on and talk about more themes. So like our water information, we also have a land information theme that supports some of our spatial data infrastructure needs, like cadastral or land ownership information, administrative boundaries, which are made up of GIS data sets like county boundaries, municipal boundaries, Senate and House district boundaries, a variety of different kinds of district boundaries, any kind of boundary that someone may need to vote on, for example, constitutes an administrative boundary. We maintain data about Montana's structures and addresses, and we'll talk more about applications of those data sets in a few minutes. And then we also maintain mapping control information, which comes out of survey control that makes sure that we understand where those parcel boundaries, land ownership boundaries, administrative boundaries, all those kinds of boundaries coincide to provide accurately mapped information. We're really proud of the fact that the Montana cadastral application was the first statewide land ownership data set in the U.S. That's a workflow that involves extensive partnerships between local governments, the Department of Revenue, and the Montana State Library. We know that most people know us for the Montana cadastral application, but really that application would not exist without the underlying cadastral data set that drives that application. That workflow involves any kind of change of land ownership that's recorded at the county. That information is then provided to the Department of Revenue, and we receive property record card information from the Department of Revenue that's then added to our cadastral data set that drives that cadastral application. So when people call us and have questions about that land ownership information, sometimes we have to refer them to either Department of Revenue or that local government to understand why the information that we've received is not yet current or not accurate. Back in 2009, we conducted an economic study or assessment of the value of the cadastral application. The approach for that economic impact study was cost avoidance for people who could readily access cadastral information online rather than having to go to a local county courthouse to get that information. And that study, conservatively in 2009, demonstrated about a $9 million annual return on investment from that cadastral application. one of the opportunities for efficiencies that we see by supporting these kinds of standardized data sets is opportunities to prevent duplication and ensure interoperability with different kinds of data sets. I think one of the most obvious examples of more opportunity is with the addressing data set. Every single state agency has to be in communication with the constituents it serves. It needs address information for the citizens they serve. We should have a single address for every Montana citizen, and I'm sad to say that that doesn't exist right now. Agencies have a variety of different address data sets that they use. Even within certain agencies, there might be multiple address data sets. So as we work through the process of creating an address standard, that's something that we hope that more and more state agencies will then adopt, making sure that we do have a single data set that reduces that need for duplication across state agencies. And then as we'll talk about moving on, those address data sets have become critical for some of our work, for example, with the Secretary of State's office, where we've been able to geo-enable their elections process or make sure that in an individual citizen's ballot, their address that's tied to those administrative boundaries accurately represents what they're seeing on their ballot in a much more standardized and geo-enabled way. And then as we'll talk about in a few minutes, we also use the same data set to help with our next generation 911 efforts. It's a great example where 20 years of expertise from our staff working to collect address information, really dating back to shortly after the 2001 terrorist attacks, when collecting structures and address information became critical for public safety. We developed expertise with those data standards. We're working with local governments to help them develop and collect that information, and now we're able to use that data across the state for multiple purposes. Julia, I did want you to click on one of the outcomes and key performance measures, the Montana cadastral adjustments. We often hear about, and you may be aware of, examples where when you're looking at a property boundary in cadastral, it doesn't necessarily align to what we're seeing on the ground. We may have a road mapped, and if you're looking at the aerial imagery, it doesn't quite align, or a bridge doesn't quite align, or a property boundary doesn't quite align. That is an example of where we need better survey control in a particular area. So a registered land surveyor needs to go out and actually collect improved survey control. And then oftentimes we're fortunate that the surveyor will share that information with us, or that survey might be made available as part of a property transaction, for example. Again, we receive that information sometimes through surveyors, sometimes through the Department of Revenue, and then we're able to use that information to update our cadastral data set. That is a time-intensive workflow, and it's not something that we're able to do very readily. I think I shared last session that we know it would, at the current pace, probably take about 100 years for us to complete survey control across the state of Montana. We do make this, it's called a story map, available for people to understand where our priority areas are for adjustment and where we are working, and obviously then where there might be need for adjustment that we're not able to address.
One quick point of clarification on this map. What you're seeing there in the overview are actually some older, those are corrections 2015 through 2018, but you can see more recent corrections across the top. There are tabs for the 2023 adjustments, 2021 adjustments, and so forth.
Our information product staff are the group of staff that then help take this information and make it web accessible. They're staff who maintain our websites, and they work to maintain the cadastral application as well as a handful of other applications that we maintain within the State Library. Most notably this last year, we worked with a contractor to build a new, more modern cadastral application, one that's mobile friendly, which we're really excited about. We're also happy that this was a application that was built with the help of a contractor rather than something that we were required to build in-house. As technology changes more and more, we're trying to move to more off-the-shelf kinds of software opportunities rather than doing the custom build applications, which are much more costly and much more difficult for us to maintain. You can see, I believe it's because the application is much more mobile friendly, that as soon as we launched the cadastral application, we started seeing significant increase in its use. Other priorities for this staff include helping us to roll out our new help desks for people to contact us with their information requests. We've adopted the state's ServiceNow application for people to contact us directly, and we've rolled that out as the kind of single point of contact tool for citizens to contact us whether they have questions about GIS or our applications, or need help with consulting requests from our librarians or use of the Montana Shared Catalog. We're in the process of rolling out tools for our Natural Heritage Program and so forth, so that we have, like I said, a single point of contact for citizens to contact us and collect and receive information from us. Our staff in the Information Products Program are also involved in helping us to update what we call our Aspen application. That's an application that really serves as our library directory, and it has a number of other modules, including it's the module where librarians and trustees track their continuing education and request certification from us. It serves as our events calendar and other tools. That was a custom in-house built application when it was created not quite a decade ago, and so we're looking at some off-the-shelf solutions to modernize that application and make it more user-friendly. And then finally, it's the excuse me, the staff of the Information Products Program that are largely responsible for maintaining our GIS architecture. That architecture is about 10 years old now, and it relies very heavily on local workstations to run a lot of our GIS jobs, and as well as the server environment in the State Information Technology Services Division environment, where we maintain our web servers and databases to support that application. As technology has become much more cloud-based, the software that we use for GIS services itself are much more adept at utilizing cloud-based solutions that would help us to modernize our workflows and improve cloud-based storage opportunities and access, et cetera. We went through an RFI in 2022 in order to look at what it would take for us to modernize the architecture and take advantage of some of these more modern softwares and cloud-based services. The result of that RFI showed about a $750,000 investment that would be necessary for us to modernize that effort. Due to some of the decline in funds from our Montana Geospatial Information Act account, we have not moved forward on any of those kinds of efforts. So that's an example of something that's lingering for us right now. Julia, if you would just click on the Montana Cadastral Application User dashboard. This is where we track usage of that cadastral application itself, I wanted to point out a couple of spikes that probably won't surprise you if you use the cadastral application to look up your geocode when you were requesting your property tax rebates. You can see we had literally more than 100, in some cases a couple 100,000 people using our cadastral application in those first couple days when people were applying for their property tax rebates.
So before we go on to the next page, I think this is probably self-evident. I'm looking back on page 38. So the ebbs and flows we see here have to do with weekends, right?
Mr. Chair, that's correct.
I had to check the bottom scale there to figure that out. Now, what I find remarkable about this is that you went from about 10,000 to 30,000 upon launch of that app. So I suppose that means that the old method of access was so clunky that people simply didn't use it. But certainly, obviously, the demand wasn't gradual. It was instantaneous.
Yes.
Meeting that demand.
Yes.
I find that rather fascinating, actually.
In that cadastral application dashboard, and I won't ask Julia to go there, but as we were building the new cadastral application and migrating off of the old, we did have a user satisfaction survey that was helping us to identify the key opportunities for improvement. And, more than 50% said that they were likely or very likely to recommend the cadastral application to other people, but about 30% said that they weren't. And I think that had to do with sort of how clunky the old application was, and that's something that's dramatically improved with the launch of the new application.
Are there any other questions on this slide for the state librarian? Please continue.
Okay. Next slide. The final position within our information access program is our data coordinator position, or data coordination. This is the person that's responsible for maintaining all of our dashboards and helping us with our data collection and data studies. Starting in the late 1990s, the Montana State Library and other state libraries were required to begin to submit what's called public library survey data to the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So, in the form of survey collection and analysis data, we've been involved in collecting that kind of data since the 1990s. But it was really in 2016 where we recognized the importance of data-informed planning and evaluation to our work. And we made a concerted effort to invest in a position that now allows us to think from the very beginning of a program or project to the kinds of data and metrics that are going to be necessary for us to determine whether or not our programs are successful and how we might evaluate those services for continued improvement. And so we hired an FTE to be responsible for that kind of work. This position administers 3 specific federal reports that we're required to do. The public library survey that I mentioned, which is a collection of statistical information and other kinds of information from Montana's public libraries that we then make available to the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We're also responsible for submitting an annual state program report. That's that federal report that you have in your materials that describes how we spend our Federal Library Services and Technology Act funds. And then we're also required to submit what's called the State Library Agency Assessment. It's a survey of state library services that compares the Montana State Library with other state libraries around the state. This position is responsible for collecting a variety of metrics for new programs like our Hotspot program. She maintains that Hotspot dashboard that we've looked at a number of times over the years. And then we tasked this position with a variety of different kinds of one-time surveys. Most recently, she worked with libraries and library staff to conduct a staffing and salary survey to help local governments understand how their library staff are paid, how that information compares to other libraries around the state as well as nationally. I mentioned in my testimony in December that we're interested in doing a geographic divide study, looking at the distances Montanans have to travel to have access to library services. She's the one that is also conducting that study and gathering and analyzing that kind of information. And you have in our outcomes key performance measures a variety of those different kinds of reports that she prepares, and you're obviously familiar with the dashboards that she maintains. Okay. All right, next slide. We're moving on to our GIS coordination work, and I think it's important to note that this position, these staff work very, very closely with the land information staff, the water information staff, the heritage program information staff, and also more and more we're working hard to have these staff work across programs. We don't view the work of these programs in silos. And just by way of an example, our staff person responsible for the Montana History Program, our government information staff person, and our water information staff person are looking at how they can use those different platforms to bring together historic water information for Montana so that anyone might have access to information about the Huntley project that's available in the history portal, coupled with the state government publications that document that effort, as well as the mapped irrigation information that we have through our water information system, telling a story over time of the impact of that program for Montanans. Again, we don't view these work in silos. We work hard to bring our tools and information expertise together to make sure that we're meeting a wide variety of Montanans' information needs. And that holds true for our GIS coordination staff, who are working with our partners to make sure that local governments, state and federal agencies are all working collectively to reduce redundancy and manage information most cost effectively. We have 4 positions budgeted and 5 modified FTE in this particular program area. I wanted to call to your attention, again, the majority of the funding for this program is through our Montana Land Information account. It's through this program where we have a contract with the Secretary of State's office specifically to work with them on their geo-enabled election initiative. Next slide. Some of the key priorities for GIS coordination right now, as I mentioned, we work closely with local governments and state agencies to make sure that we're collecting information once, that information follows standards, and that we're using that information in a wide variety of purposes. As I said, just recently we launched ServiceNow to help manage and track the GIS requests that we're getting from state agencies and partners and private citizens, so we have a better record of the kinds of requests that we're getting. We can then use that information to build knowledge bases as well as more self-service tools to help citizens get the information they need more directly. One of the things that we've been working on in conjunction with the Montana Geospatial Advisory Committee is some strategic planning for our GIS coordination work. That strategic planning has focused on opportunities to better enhance GIS data standards. I mentioned the opportunity for us to create an address standard for the state of Montana. I think that will be one of our top priorities now that we have a workflow in place for adoption of those kinds of standards. And we know we need to do more outreach to our partners, our potential partners, as well as the citizens of Montana to make sure that everyone is aware and making use of the information that we make available. It's really through this effort of collecting our geospatial information and making it available that we're able to support a variety of industries, from public sector work to public safety to the geo-enabled elections and so forth. One of the opportunities that I also wanted to bring to the committee's attention is opportunity for more collection of imagery data. We, in 2023, hosted an imagery summit. There was between 70 and 80 stakeholders there, many of them from state and federal agencies who either have imagery collections or have need for imagery to improve their business processes. You may have just heard recently that there was a legislative audit that calls upon the Department of Revenue to make more use of imagery for property tax assessment work, and that audit specifically suggests that Department of Revenue should be working with the state library to have a common imagery collection. And again, the point behind that is imagery is expensive to collect. It can be used for a wide variety of purposes, and so it should be commonly collected and made commonly available so that local governments and state and federal agencies aren't creating duplicate collections and bearing the cost of collecting imagery that is not centralized and made commonly available. So that's something that's a need that we're aware of that we're not currently addressing. And similarly, as agencies and organizations are making use of drone technology or the unmanned aerial technology to collect imagery, we're seeing more and more imagery collection for things like areas impacted by flooding. And those partners are calling upon the state library to help create data standards for how imagery is collected and then how it's maintained and made available. One of the other responsibilities that these staff have, and this was one where we were asked what statutory requirements this work meets. I'd say there's not a statutory requirement for this. These staff are tasked with helping to administer the enterprise license agreement for GIS software that's used by state agencies. The vendor is Esri, and that's an expensive contract that agencies rely on for access to their GIS software. Over the years, we've tried to give back responsibility of that contract administration to the State Technology Services Division because it is just a contract for software. And our staff are happy to serve as the subject matter experts to help understand the various licensing models and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, in our view, managing the Esri ELA is no different than managing the state's Microsoft agreement or the agreement with Adobe or the agreement with ServiceNow. That is something that we feel we would love to get off our plate if there was an opportunity to better coordinate with the Department of Administration. Our staff spend a significant number of hours every year having to administer that enterprise license agreement. So an opportunity for efficiency and something that's perhaps not managed as cost effectively as it might. A program administered by our both our grants and contracts staff person under Central Services and our state GIS coordination is the Geospatial Information Act grant program. This is a program that's funded by the Montana Geospatial Information Act dollars. We don't have any dedicated staff that administer this program. Julie, if you'll go to the next slide. So this program began with the passage of what was the Montana Land Information Act in 2005 and now continues under the Geospatial Information Act. Again, it's funded by the Geospatial Information Act dollars. As you know, we've seen a significant decline in revenue in those dollars. We use these grants to help local governments collect data that then benefits them at the local level and then rolls up to help support our geospatial information collections to improve the Montana spatial data infrastructure. So that's really been the intent of this grant program. Over the years, we've hoped that it's helped to build geospatial capacity in local levels. I think we've been successful in that outcome to varying degrees, but this really is an essential tool to make sure that we have funding going out to local governments to help them do better mapping and survey control to improve their addressing data and so forth. In FY24, we had rolled out a grant program, but we were not able to extend any grants that were not completed within that fiscal year due to a decline in revenue, and we have not awarded any FY25 grants because the funding simply isn't there. And looking at revenue in that account, it's very likely that we won't award grants in FY26 or for the foreseeable future. We are, however, using this opportunity to conduct an internal review of the grant program. We're considering what the outcomes and impacts of the program are, what we hope that they will be, and we're looking at factors such as the budget necessary for us to make sure that we're able to achieve those kinds of outcomes, the timing of the grant awards to make sure that it works for local governments, so that if they're collecting survey control, for example, their surveyors are able to be out on the ground when the weather's conducive to conducting those survey controls. We're looking at things like how we administer the grant program and whether or not we need improved software services to help administer that program. We hope to have our internal review completed by the end of September in order to inform grant priorities for upcoming fiscal years that would be included in our geospatial information plan. And Julia, if you would just click on the outcomes and key performance measures. There's a robust history of our grant awards. You can see where they've been awarded in counties across the state and how much has been awarded and the kinds of projects that have been supported through this program over the years. Okay. We're going to wrap up the GIS data and information programs with a couple of our newest programs. First, the Next Generation 911 program. There's one position budgeted for this effort, and this effort is funded by a statutory appropriation from the state's 911 dollars. And that was passed under statute in 2021. We had completed an assessment. Julia, you can go on to the next slide, sorry. We had completed an assessment back in 2018 that looked at the completeness and accuracy of local governments' public safety data. How well did the data meet the national standards in order to support modern public safety, including next generation 911 services that allows 911 services to be geo-enabled, making use of precise location information to inform a rapid emergency response. So in 2021, the legislature created a 10-year statutory appropriation to help to fund data development and improvement to support next generation 911. Our work supports the state in two different ways. Like our work with libraries, we maintain a single contract that any public safety answering point in the state can use to assess their GIS data. So we maintain that contract. And then our staff person goes around the state and helps to educate and train local government officials on how to collect data, improve the data they have, and then use the software to assess the readiness and accuracy of that data in order to support next generation 911. And then, Julia, if you'd click on the outcomes and key performance measures. There are a wide variety of different assessments that local governments are required to do to demonstrate that they've reached 100% compliance with the next generation 911 standards. So we're tracking that assessment work as it increases. And we also have an outreach tab that's tracking our efforts to engage with those local government officials. It's really the outreach component of this work that's most critical in helping local governments to improve and meet the requirements for next generation 911. So we wanted to make sure that we were collecting and providing information about where we're meeting with officials, how many people we're meeting, the number of trainings we're offering, and so forth, because there's a direct correlation with that work and then those local governments' abilities to complete those assessments. And then finally, as local governments are able to collect that information rolls up to the state library, where we collect it into statewide emergency response boundaries, which are also necessary for next generation 911. We need to know where ambulance districts are, for example, to make sure that when a call is routed for a PSAP, it's routed to the correct responding district, that there aren't districts that overlapped, and most importantly, that there are no gaps in the map districts where someone just might not respond because it's uncertain who should respond to that kind of call.
Representative Keel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. State Librarian, I'm just looking at the map of who's ready, or the readiness tracking. And just remind me, when did this start? When did they begin the work?
Mr. Chair, Representative Keough, some of these PSAPs had started prior to our concerted effort with them. Our concerted effort began with legislation in 2021.
Mr. Chair, State Librarian, I mean, like some counties haven't started.
Mr. Chair, Representative Keough, that's correct.
And follow up, Mr. Chair. What happens next? I mean, how do we get them started or get them going? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Representative Keough, our staff are continuing their outreach efforts. I would say when we had our Montana Geospatial Information Act grants, that was certainly an incentive that we don't have right now. I also sit on the state's 911 Advisory Council, and they are going through a process right now of adopting improved technologies. And we know that local governments are going to need this data for them to take advantage of that more modern 911 systems. And so at some point, they will have to complete this process in order to make use of those new systems.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Montana Library Director, quick question on procedure. Correct me if I'm wrong. Under this new generation 911 system, let's take a hypothetical example. Someone is driving down Interstate 90, and they see a situation that requires a 911 response. They get on their cell phone and they call 911. Tell me how the 911 respondent knows where they're at.
Mr. Chair, Vice Chair Fuller, I would be out of my depth if I attempted to answer, but we'd be very happy to get that answer for you.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you.
Other questions?
Unless Evan can.
Mr. Hammond.
Mr. Chair, the one small bit that I can provide for you is that currently the way that location information is provided to the response center, the call center, is through cell phone sectors. So it's a very broad area that a device could be located in. In the next gen 911 model, the device is broadcasting its precise location. And that actual location is going to be used to pinpoint where response needs to go.
Follow up, Mr. Chair?
Follow up.
Yeah. Then would that be dependent upon the person having their GPS locator on their phone turned on?
Mr. Vice Chair, this is where it gets beyond my. I have a basic understanding personally that devices that I've seen automatically report location for emergency response, but that's beyond that. That goes outside of my area of expertise. Sorry.
Thank you. My mind wanders on the situations like that, dealing with first responding issues. Thank you.
We'd be happy to get more information for you.
So with respect to the next generation 911 program, is it correct to say that the library is playing a supporting role in this endeavor?
Mr. Chair, very much so. A supporting and training role with regard to the actual data.
And is it correct to say that the data that you're responsible for and you're receiving funding for is actually GIS-related, location-related data?
Mr. Chair, that's correct. It's really, yeah, address and location data. It involves some transportation data as well, which are all themes of the spatial data infrastructure. So again, we're trying to use the data that we have been maintaining for years and years in this application to meet modern public safety needs.
And which agency has the lead for next generation 911?
Mr. Chair, it's the Department of Justice.
Thank you. Any further questions? All right, please continue.
All right. Next slide. We're concluding with our newest program, the Montana State Reference Network, that we've had a chance to visit with over the interim, for the last couple of interims. The Montana State Reference Network has one position budgeted. It's largely been funded with appropriations from our land information account. And as you know, we now have the new enterprise proprietary funding where we're collecting subscriptions for service access to the reference network. I think by now most of you are familiar with what the reference network is. If you want to go on to the next slide. It's the statewide network of global positioning reference stations that utilize GPS software to create a network for hyper-precise location information. As you know, we passed legislation in 2023 to create that enterprise fund and to authorize the state library to operate the Montana State Reference Network. It's used by a variety of industries in the public and private sector. In our efforts to promote the State Reference Network, we've been working most directly with the surveying community. We're going to begin our outreach to the precision ag community more and more in the coming months. In testimony last legislative session, the Department of Transportation estimated that they save between $1.5 and $2 million annually by having access to the state reference network. And so we've been working hard to make sure that the network is being built out and that people are aware of it and utilizing it. Of course, the decline in funding for the geospatial information account is affecting our ability to more effectively roll out the network at this point. We had plans to hire a technical support person to support the state reference network operator. We have not hired that position due to the decline in revenue. At this point, we're beginning to see impacts in our ability to add stations to the network. For example, MDT has about 4 stations that are ready to go on the network, but due to a lack of funds, we haven't been able to invest in the nodes necessary to add them to the network. We do have a number of stations statewide now, but at this point we probably have as many stations as we can add until we start to see some funding increases. We are concerned that that might affect our ability to attract more subscribers in areas that we're not able to serve through the network. We do have 69 logins secured through the subscription model. Our goal is to reach 100 by the end of this fiscal year. Looking at the appropriation that is in the current budget, we would need probably about 130 subscribers to fully realize that appropriation. And as I've mentioned before, we think it's important to make sure that we have some operating revenue in our enterprise fund for this account to make sure that we have the ability to manage changes in the revenue cycle that we're likely to see as subscribers come on and potentially drop off in the future. And I just want to remind the committee our targeted glide path for making sure that the state network is fully sustainable is 2029. So that's our target.
Representative Keel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. State Librarian, I don't want to get in the weeds too much. Can you just give me an example, though, of Precision Ag and how they would use this? Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Representative Keough, I'm sure Representative Jones could do this far better than I, but a tractor that has GPS equipment can connect into this reference network, and when they are applying seed or applying fertilizer to their area, they are able to do so making use of that precise location to make sure they're not overseeding or over fertilizing. They're doing so precisely on the land that they wish to seed or fertilize, and that can result in significant cost savings for them.
Other questions? You mentioned a glide path through 2029. That's assuming what revenue stream?
That's a good question. That would be reliant on our MGF funds that we've been reliant on over the last several years to make sure that we have a source of revenue. The fully built out network would be built out with around 160 stations. We are hoping by then to have around 500 subscribers. Of course, our costs are less right now. This also assumes that we're funding 2 positions. Our costs are less right now because we only have 1 position that we're funding, and we're not building out the network at the pace that this would anticipate. Mr. Chair, it looks like you have a question.
Yes, I have a question. So I just want to be clear. You have a shortfall in your funding stream now, and that's in the proposed budget here as well. So assuming that we have that, we do not rectify that, and you must live upon whatever we've given you or the subscriber fees that you collect. Is 2029 still your target, or is it pushed out, and if so, how far? Under the assumption that no action is taken here beyond what's been proposed.
We have not done an analysis of how long the glide path is impacted. I think we would probably need to go back and change some of the assumptions, like the staffing that's available, the number of nodes that are available, and what that impact might be on the number of subscribers that we're able to generate with less investment.
I ask you to do that analysis because I think 2029 is a best case scenario, a fully funded scenario. And so I think we'll take a look at what if, and I think I just told you what the parameters were for what if. Are there any other questions right now? State Librarian, do you have anything else for us? Excuse me, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Representative Keel.
Oh, Mr. Chair, thanks. State Librarian. So is there a list somewhere of the 69 members? Or, no, they're not members.
The
They're
subscribers?
subscribers.
There are. Mm-hmm.
I look at. Is it public information?
Mr. Chair, Representative Keough, I would question whether that's public information and under the Montana Library Records Confidentiality Act. So.
Thank you. I was just follow up, just curious, kind of. While they,
Mr. Chair,
what industries they represent.
That I could certainly provide you.
Thank you.
Right, a representation of which industries are taking advantage of this, I think would answer the question with.
Great, happy to provide that.
Excellent. Anything else in your presentation to make?
I just want to conclude by saying that I hope through this deep dive that we've met our objective in helping you to better understand what we do and why we do it. And as you go forward and contemplate opportunities to help better support education, K-12 and higher education, you keep some of those people that we serve in mind. I hope that we've demonstrated to you how we support teachers and academics. And as you continue on in your work throughout this legislative session, I hope you will consider other opportunities where you now recognize the role that the State Library is playing to address a wide variety of policy and legal opportunities. I was appointed by President Trump to serve on the advisory board for the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And so I had an opportunity to get to know his director. His name was Crosby Kemper. And Mr. Kemper used to say that he measures the success of libraries by their local government officials turning to their libraries and recognizing the problem-solving opportunities that their libraries bring to any kind of community challenge. And at our heart, that's what we are. We are problem solvers. And I hope that you've come to recognize the variety of different kinds of opportunities that can be addressed through the problem solving resources and information that the State Library brings. We are a small agency, and our work often goes unseen, but that doesn't make it any less important and any less valuable. Our work really does boil down to tried and true in library work in providing access to information to the people that need it. And I hope you've come to see and better understand how the State Library does reduce redundancy and increase transparency, how we are supporting the commerce of Montana and ultimately saving Montana taxpayers money. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee.
Mr. Chair.
Vice Chairman Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have several, if you'll indulge me, several general questions. First question is, I would be interested in the director's reasoning as to why there's been a 46% decrease in library attendance since 2013.
Mr. Chair, Vice Chair Fuller, I believe you're referring to visitation statistics in Montana public libraries.
Correct.
Correct. Mr. Chair, Vice Chair Fuller, I can hypothesize on why visitation may be declining in public libraries. One of the things that we see is that we're seeing skyrocketing usage in online resources and ebooks and e-audiobooks. That means that people don't have to actually come into the library in order to gain access to library information. And then of course, we saw a significant drop-off in visitation to libraries during the pandemic. It's starting to rebound. I don't think it's quite at pre-pandemic levels yet. But one of the things we see when we compare visitation metrics to utilization of online information resources and digital resources is that there is a decline in visitation and a significant increase in online usage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A quick follow-up. I surmise that would be your answer, and if I was director, that would have been my answer too. So thank you for that. I just have one other question. Upon whom is Montana Library System dependent on for floodplain information? Since floodplain information is so important for property owners, upon whom are we dependent, or are you dependent for this data?
Mr. Chair and Vice Chair Fuller, and I might turn to Evan, but we work closely with DNRC's floodplain mapping program. They are making use of the LIDAR data that we've collected in our LIDAR inventory to inform their floodplain mapping.
Mr. Vice Chair, that's correct. We don't, I don't know of any direct floodplain data. We, when we speak of the federal floodplain program, FEMA programs that we house at the State Library, we direct people to the Department of Natural Resources floodplain program. And as the director said, we have worked very closely with them to collect the LIDAR data in areas where they had interest.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Other questions from members of the committee? Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for an excellent presentation for this section's first deep dive. Certainly, I think we are looking at one other program and one other agency. Now, it happens to be the agency that has about a $1 billion a year program. So we'll be taking a look at that specific program. But you and your staff have certainly met and probably exceeded most people's expectations here in terms of the quality of the data that you provided us. Now, one would think that I'm going to adjourn this meeting now, but I'm not. Instead, without objection, we'll take a 15-minute recess and then offer members of the committee opportunities to interact with you a little bit further, ask a few questions. I know I have several, but in the spirit of meeting my promise to Representative Keogh, we will recess until 10:45, 15 minutes from now. This committee stands in recess. This meeting will come back to order. Okay, at this time, we'll entertain any questions from the committee. The idea is to prepare ourselves for, is to look forward and kind of prepare ourselves for the work session. A work session we'll have a week from Thursday on the 23rd of January, where we'll be thinking about and discussing what we've heard from the State Library, and actually will be the Office of Public Instruction at the same time. So with that in mind, are there any questions? And I think Representative Matthews.
Thank you,
Go
Mr.
ahead.
Chair. State Librarian, thank you so much. First, that blew my mind. I am super impressed. I pictured, you know, I'm a teacher, library in our school, has all the books and some other stuff, and I just pictured like a giant library somewhere that sent out more books, and that absolutely blew my mind. I think my question is, I'm thinking about going forward. I heard a few of the, like, where there's some shortfalls and things, and I want to know what it is you need from us to keep everything whole and keep us moving forward, especially with like the GIS information. We don't want to fall behind on that. And how can we set you up for success and stability into the future?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I really appreciate that question. Our staff have put a lot of time and effort into thinking about short-term and long-term needs. We did share that information with our State Library Commission last spring. At this point, we don't have any direct funding requests at their direction, but I could share that information with you.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Other questions? Well, it won't. Oh, did you have one, Representative Barker? Okay. One thing that came to my mind is, as you may know, the Bureau of Mines and Geology has a data preservation program. Do you have any interface with that particular program and the work that they're doing there? By the way, we provide funding separately through the OCHI budget for the work being done at the School of Mines.
Mr. Chair, we do, and I don't know if Evan is prepared to speak to that or if we need to get back to you. They do maintain one of the spatial data infrastructure themes, the geology theme, and our water information staff in particular do work closely with them. We could provide you some examples of how.
I give you a funny look when you looked over at me because Montana, we work a lot with Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology. As Director Stapp mentioned, the geology theme. We also have seats on the Surface Water Supply Committee. There are a couple of different committees like that. Specifically, the Data Preservation Program, I don't know that we have a relationship there. So that's why I wanted to clarify.
Well, thank you. I'd like you to go back. I just don't quite recall. It seems like that data preservation program has to do with hydrological data, if I remember correctly. But if you might just look back and see what your relationship is with that. What I'm aiming at is I don't want to be duplicating effort, and we probably aren't. But if the State Library is charged with making data available, presumably whatever's being preserved by that bureau, should be being made available and might most effectively be made available through your efforts on behalf of them. I don't know. So if you could report back on that, it would be useful. My next question, and by the way, if I see a hand come up from any of my colleagues, I'll quickly stop asking questions and allow someone else to chime in. You mentioned a contract management that you thought might be more effectively done by the Department of Administration, and I think you said the ESRI contract. Can you spell that for me, please?
Mr. Chair, that's ESRI, ESRI.
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 Oh, I almost had it. I had a Y instead of an I. All right. Should the Department of Administration take that burden off of you, how much of a budgeted position reduction would you see that could be made?
Mr. Chair, we don't have a full-time position dedicated to that effort. That's the work of our state GIS coordinator, and she probably puts in half a dozen hours a month or so on that effort.
And does she adequately manage the project?
I
The
believe,
contract, excuse me, the contract.
I believe she adequately manages it. I believe her time could be better spent elsewhere.
Have you had any communications with the Department of Administration on this particular issue?
Mr. Chair, we have off and on over the years. It's dependent on whether they have staff that are available to more directly manage it or not.
Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you, Ms. Hall, because I was about to say this sounds like an executive branch discussion that I'm about to step out of, but Ms. Hall.
Mr. Chair, this has been going on for a number of years, and the administration, ITSD, didn't want to manage this anymore because it's with the library that they were overseeing this. They were making sure this is what their NRIS costs were for the pass-throughs and all of that. And years ago, there was discussion as to whether it would be at ITSD or the library, and they've just taken it on. I believe there's a considerable amount of funding in your budget as well for the Esri contract. Is that not correct, or is that part of no, it's in the fixed costs now. So it is in the fixed costs. It's about a $2 million hit for the Esri contract, and the library oversees working with all the agencies and all of that kind of stuff. So it has been discussed through the administration.
Thank you. Well, that clarifies that. So I want to, I've made reference to a couple of these things during the course of our hearings, and I think something that we should follow up on during our work, during our work session should be, I'd like to take a little more focused look at the, now I guess now what is referred to as the Montana Geospatial Information Act account, formerly known as the Montana Land Information Account, the projected revenue flow into that through the biennium and perhaps even beyond if we, I mean, I recognize projections are just projections. Clearly, this is a source of funding that is relied upon by a number of your programs, including the Reference Network program. So understanding that a bit further, it's absolutely essential for you to do that so you can answer the question I posed earlier, assuming current revenue streams and no other sources of, well, general fund injections of general fund. What is your timeline for completing the project? That also includes, of course, smart marketing and bringing subscribers on. And I'm interested let me just step back. I'll come to that in a minute. So I think it's important for us to understand where that money is. I think there are some opportunities. I'm interested in taking a look at what you really need for an ending fund balance at the end of each year. I believe that there may be some modest opportunities to switch out some general fund requests that are in the proposed budget now and replace it with Montana Geospatial Information Act revenue. And to that end, I'd like you to take a look at give me an inventory of where that could possibly take place, where you could do a general fund switch. Tally it up instead of in one place. So we're taking a look at where fund switches might be made. It's contingent on our analysis of the fund. With respect to the reference network, very interested in knowing what the impact of reduced funding stream is on that. I do not see much of of a chance to replace that by going into statute and increasing recording fees. We did that in 2021, was it? I carried the bill. I just can't remember which year it was. I don't believe that there'll be any appetite for doing that. So I think that subscription fees are important, and the use of that enterprise account is factoring that into your funding stream is important as well for that particular project. I know there's arguments to be made that obviously you need to have an operating balance in your account. Would never suggest that you need to draw your account down to nothing, but if you're in somewhat lean years from a revenue standpoint, I mean, it becomes a business decision as to whether the drawing down your account and taking some risk associated with that is worth the increase in number of subscribers that you might achieve. Be interested to see what your business plan is on that. Finally, I was very impressed with the way you were able to describe your agency by dividing it into the 3 programs that you have put forward. It's the kind of transparency that I think is necessary to answer or to illustrate to the public what Representative Matthews, the epiphany he had, which was an epiphany I had a few years ago as well, that the library isn't a brick and mortar place with books, regrettably, but instead it's much, much more, and the state library is much, much more. So to that end, prior to our work session on the 23rd, I would like to see a proposal for breaking the House Bill 2 budget into 3 programs and not 1. And I think, I would entertain any sort of, you can title them as you'd like. I think you have good titles already. And I've talked to Julie about this. I'd like to see the decision packages that would accompany that. By the way, the work session is just a discussion time. We're not taking executive action, but I want to be able to have the committee take a look at what this would look like and the kinds of decisions we would have to make just to implement this accounting change. So the other thing I would like you to do is I think there are some line item opportunities in each of these programs, particularly for very discrete programs like the reference network, and I think there's some other opportunities. I'd like you to consider inclusion of line items underneath the programs where necessary. Now, what I want to avoid in the recommendation that comes forward, and I'm sure you'll be doing this in conjunction with the budget office and my fiscal analyst here, is we need to avoid creating a structure that inhibits your operations. So I'm not interested. It's up to the committee, of course, but I think it would be unwise to overly restrict your line items in your programs so as to impede the movement of money from one line item or from one program to another. One of the things that's evident from the presentations you've made here is that you haven't siloed your operations. And I don't want a siloed budget, but I want a budget that conforms to the way your operations are put forward. If we had siloed operations here, I think all of us around the table would agree that would lead to enormous inefficiencies. And by that, I mean if you had people in each of these programs you had and they weren't able to talk to someone else or work across the line, and we had to duplicate positions and that sort of thing, it would be grossly ineffective. And it's the same with respect to the movement of money and funds and that sort of thing. So I hope that I've articulated my request there, and I don't think my colleagues will object to this as well. So by the 23rd of January, let's see what we can put together. The other thing, I know that the Library Commission has not asked you to carry forward any additional any additional budget asks beyond what's in the executive budget, and I respect that. I think the only thing that we should probably ponder during the work session, and we probably needn't ponder it right now, we need some time to think about it, is, what are the priorities on some of the programs that you have that are shorted in funding? I would posit that we're not going to satisfy all of those shortcomings. But a sense of priority, I think, is important. And that prioritization is not yours, it's ours. And so as we understand what you're doing, and if we come to the conclusion, particularly with respect to the availability of this, I still call it Montana Land Information Act, the recording fee funding, the resolution of that, we may have to decide where that money ought to be going first, and then we can have a discussion of whether we need an infusion of general fund. I had asked the librarian to take a look at other state special revenue sources, but I'm only interested in those that are under the library, and I am, in the interest of not getting beaten by my fellow members of the Appropriation Committee and other sections, I'm not, at this time, interested in raiding anybody else's state special revenue accounts, unless, well, never mind.
Unless it's necessary.
Well, unless Senator Fuller does it for me. All joking aside, I think that's a long haul. I think the real discussion that needs to be had on revenues here is, what is our best projection, with what are the margins of error associated with the inflow of recording fee funds, and just how much would we be asking for from a general fund standpoint to rectify any of these things. It'd be a heavy lift, but unless we have the information, we can't even have the discussion. We'll have that discussion on the 23rd. State Librarian, you'll be invited to come to this as a resource. On the 23rd, our work session is not a hearing. We won't be taking public comment, and we won't be taking action. We'll just be scanning through our notes here and trying to come to some conclusion that will inform us when we take executive action in mid-February. Ms. Hall, do you have anything from a budget office perspective right now?
Mr. Chair, I do not.
Thank you. Anything from members of the committee? Is there any public comment? I see none in the room. Is there any public comment online? Julia, did I miss anything?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, the only thing that I would mention is that we have scheduled executive action for the fixed cost NRIS rate for Thursday this week.
Fixed costs that we charge the Agency for Library GIS services. Right, and we have and the proposed change to that is already embedded in the executive budget, so we've already had the hearing on that, but we must actually officially dispense with that, and we'll do that on Thursday. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, this hearing is adjourned.